Okay, the recording is now on.
Hey, welcome everyone. This is Sheila Cook, and it's the last day of April 2020, and I am so glad to have Phyllis Van Amburgh. I am so excited. There she is. Phyllis is farming in upstate New York, and I had the privilege of working with Phyllis a few years ago, and we wrote a case study together. And that case study was called Less Stress, More Grass. And I think I'm going to send that as one of the follow-on documents because it was such a good case study. And it was all about their experience of making this shift from rotational grazing to holistic management. And it was a huge transformative process. And the reason this webinar came up is I'm teaching a holistic planned grazing course right now online. And a big discussion came up on how do you really want us to collapse those herds and deal with multiple sires in one herd? How do you really deal with that? And when the first person I thought of, I bet Phyllis can help us with that. And she was so happy to do that. So without further ado, I am going to turn this right over to Phyllis. And so I'll pass the baton to Phyllis and she'll bring up her PowerPoint. And we are recording this and we'll be posting this to the 3LM YouTube channel.
So I guess it's good afternoon for me, but I think it's good evening for a lot of you guys. And thank you very much for the opportunity here. I'm gonna get back here. So managed inbreeding, we landed on that title. Mostly it was intriguing for me to think about that. We are either managing to not inbreed, and there are a few who actually manage in order to accomplish inbreeding. But I subtitled it herd development because I think that's really the question. How are we going to develop our herds when we consolidate them? Of course, as a student of holistic management, the first thing you have to consider is your context. So what are you working with? You need to really take just a minute and define your herd for yourself. What's the current relation of the members of your herd? Are they members of one breed only? Are they many breeds? Do you have one strong members of one family within one breed? Do you already have a high level of relativity? What size is your herd? What cow type you have? The number, the size cow, excuse me, the size of cow, the type of cow, the number in your herd, what function they are carrying out for you and what function you want them to carry out in the future. And what gene pool do you have not only within your herd, but also accessible to you? This hopefully seems very elementary, but these are all exactly the kinds of things that you need to tend to and visit intentionally before you start to think about how you're going to manage the breeding of your herd, because all of those factors are going to very heavily impact the way you approach this problem. And of course, implicit in the context is creating a vision of the herd you're trying to develop. Whether you want to keep it the same, whether you want to make some adjustments, that's you know, the next step is where are we going to go once we decide what we have. So as I mentioned, do you have more than one breed within your herd? What is the relative blood? Does any inbreeding already exist? And do they fit your context of what you're trying to produce, what your level for change is, and what your desire for new blood? And also I would add, what is the availability of new or of new blood that you would like to pull from? So where are we beginning and what are we starting with? That's that question there. Pretty sure the way I use inbreeding and line breeding is pretty common. To me, inbreeding is the breeding of close relations. So for example, if you're going to breed siblings to one another, or if you're going to breed a parent to an offspring, that's inbreeding. You're breeding two animals that are already closely related. Line breeding is a breeding program that's largely kept within one family line. So you have one strong family and you want to sort of breed within that. There's sort of a melding of these two things that are happening, at least in the United States. I suspect it's happening in most other places. There's kind of a melding of this happening within the breed registries. And breed registries have shifted their purpose and their methodology over the decades. But in general, people here are trying to avoid inbreeding, but there is a limited gene pool. So they end up sort of half line breeding and half inbreeding. Usually when we make a decision on a negative, it's a poor decision, making decisions by default. So deciding to breed, and what I mean by that is deciding to breed because this animal is not related to this animal is, in a sense, not an intentional thing. It's a breeding by default. You have a negative reason for making that choice, and that can lead to unintended consequences. So that's sort of where we find ourselves within breeds. And I'd be curious to know, and maybe if you have a chat function, Sheila or Christopher, if the participants could just maybe give us an idea of how many people are dealing with purebred herds and how many people are dealing with mixed breed herds. That would sort of help me guide my talk a little bit more specifically, because there is sort of a big difference there. And then an outcross is a breeding to a distant relation or to an unrelated individual. So here's an example that we had years back on our farm.
Excuse me, Phyllis. I just want to interrupt you. Yeah, let's get people using the chat. That's a great idea.
Yeah, feel free.
So for those, I see good. People are finding the chat and you're getting a lot of answers to that chat question that you had.
Great. And I've already explained the reason for wanting to know whether we're dealing with mixed. By the way, we started out with a very mixed herd. We had a lot of already F1 crosses, mixed breeds, some purebreds, but from different herds. And we had, it was about 44 cows and very few of them were related. I think we had 1 or 2 cows and with them, if I remember, one had 3 daughters by 3 different sires. One came with 2, a few of them came with a couple of daughters. But overall, the relation of our beginning herd was very, very diluted. There was no relation at all. There were even many different breeds. But here's an example of some of the initial inbreeding that we did with our herd. This cow here on the top left is Rizzo. And her dam was Frenchie, who was probably just a grade small-framed Holstein. And we bred her to Rex, and we got Rizzo. Then we bred Rizzo back again to her own sire, and we got Kanicki, this bull here. And I'll talk again about a reason to do this. When the intention is to concentrate the paternal genes, when you want to concentrate the genes of the sire, this is one of the methods that you can use to accomplish that. It would be much more powerful if they were within the same breed, but Rex was a milking Devon bull. So it was the first cross. This Rizzo was just an F1 sort of pretty heavy outcross. But this is inbreeding. This is an example of inbreeding. There are very practical reasons to intentionally inbreed. It keeps a relation to a great individual very high. It helps uncover recessives. So when you inbreed, you breed close, and you do this for many generations, you can sort of uncover those desirable genes because they will eventually come together, and then those animals are culled. What that essentially does is it removes those genes from your gene pool. So now that combination is effectively eliminated from your herd. It's a very dangerous game. It takes usually decades. But if you think of inbreeding as a way to concentrate pairs of genes together always eliminating the undesirable and keeping only the desirable and wanted genes, what you get at the end is something without all of those other possibilities. You get a very homozygous individual because you're constantly culling away the things that you don't want. You start out with, you know, this many genes, you keep breeding close, getting rid of combinations that you don't like. And what you end up at the end is a very, very prepotent individual. And this was really the way breeds and herds were managed for a very long time. It's essentially how a breed is created, by selection and selective culling. So it increases the prepotency. And, you know, this was how we had sort of rubber stamp sires. And, you know, people used to be able to say, oh yeah, that cow is out of so-and-so, because the herds were so distinct. The number of genes that existed within the herd was very limited, and they were very, and that was sort of a rubber stamp for each place. It does increase the prepotency, and it helps form a uniform and distinct family. And really, the herd was the family. And it is economical if your present sire is of very high merit. So if it's very difficult to procure another sire that you have you know, a high use for, you can use inbreeding as shown in the slide before to create a son that has very similar genetic composition to that sire.
Phyllis,
Yeah.
what is prepotency? I'm not familiar.
Prepotency is sort of like potentness. So someone who, a prepotent bull will transmit the phenotype, the genes, and the expression of those genes very effectively. We've seen, and maybe you guys have too, we've seen that, you know, you have this great cow and you breed her to a sire, and really what you get is, and it may be desirable, but what you get is a rubber stamp of the cow. That cow has some prepotency, but the sire has none. So when you breed something and really you see no effective result, then there's a very low prepotency. When you see all of a sudden, it's very obvious that that offspring is a result of that sire or dam, you have, especially sire it's used, you have a very prepotent bull. So this is a way, this is sort of high level. You need to start with very high quality animals. You have exceptional animals. You can inbreed those animals. It's very risky, it's very dangerous. You run the risk of going down a road and eliminating genes that you don't intend. You can eliminate good genes on the way. So you can end up in a corner you don't want to be in. But on the other hand, it is a very effective way to create a very concentrated animal. I just wanted to put that out there as a reason to inbreed. It's not really what I'm suggesting as a practical management of inbreeding. It's just, that's one of the options. It's a way to create breeding stock, as I said, of prepotency. I thought this was a wonderful quote. So no animal can be judged as a breeder of good stock by its personal appearance. There are two ways of judging a breeding animal. We must judge the animal on its direct effect on the quality of its offspring, and whether it transmits useful inherited factors, and whether it does not transmit useless and harmful factors. It's just a way of saying, keep your eyes open and make sure that every generation is better than the previous. And a good breeding animal, a good cow will always have a daughter who's better than she is, and a good bull will always improve his sons and daughters. So this is Rex. This is the sire of the cow that and the bull that I just showed you. And he was the bull that we used for the first 12 years at our other farm. And I'll explain that even after 12 years, we started with something that was so unrelated that we really only had one generation of Rex, even at the end of 12 years. But that's just our context. So Harrier Fields Velvet Rex, he was a milk Devon bull. He was very closely line bred. There was some what would be considered inbreeding on both sides. And he had a lot of family members that appeared on both sides of his pedigree, and he was very prepotent. He was beautiful. I loved that bull. He was amazing. And so here's just a shot of his daughters, his F1 daughters. And this is just, as I said, we had a very diverse herd. We wanted to bring some vigor, some strength, some grazing ability. We have pretty harsh winters and our cows spend a lot of time outside, so we wanted a very strong cow. So a milking Devon really has been bred for oxen in this country. So it worked very well. But you can see that even, I mean, we had some red and black were the colors that came through. But he really rubber stamped all of his daughters. They all look very much the same. So we did get uniformity, strength, vitality, grazing efficiency, and vigor. Now the trick is, what do you do next? It's easy to have just an outcross. Because the ultimate goal of a breeding group of animals is to make the group so pure that every animal will react in the same way to the same environment. The last thing you want to do is to have a specific program for every cow, right? When you've got a herd, you want to be able to just manage it. So it's much easier to get a maximum profit from a group of animals that reacts the same way under the same influences than to have to work with a lot of idiosyncrasies. I've known dairy farmers that do that, but I don't believe for myself that that is the most profitable way to go. So we've got our F1, we got a bunch of uniformity, but you know, just like a Jersey Holstein cross, really that's a terminal cross. So what do you do from here? The only other option we have out there is a three-way cross, to cross within 3 different breeds. But that's not necessarily helpful for those of us that are trying to stay within a breed, or for those of us that want to run one herd. So now we'll shift a little bit towards line breeding. And if you remember, that's when I refer to that, that's breeding within one family. So the essence of line breeding is to stop the diluting effects of outcrossing, always bringing in very different blood, stop those diluting effects so as to conserve the desired qualities of an esteemed ancestor, but at the same time keep the intensity of inbreeding mild enough that the effects of random survival or elimination of the genes from the population will not get beyond the control of selection. So it's a way of keeping your herd closely related, but not letting inbreeding get out of control and keeping it at a place that's manageable for your selection process. And selection is obviously a very important piece. This is from an article entitled "A Line Breeding Program for Horse Breeding." And the authors are P.V. Pearson and J. Lush. Anybody who really wants to study breeding, J.L. Lush is an excellent resource. And I've just got at least one excellent book and several articles. He wrote in the 30s. So here we have an example of line breeding. So this Jersey cow's name is Luna. Her mother was a grade Jersey named Princess Leia, and her sire is Duke's Landy. We took a couple of sons that you can see, Sunny and Regal Moon, both out of Luna. So Sunny is out of Luna and Rex. Butterfly, this heifer with the green halter on, is also Luna and Rex. So this bull at her side and the heifer are full brother and sister. Reggie, we bred Luna back to her son, and her son Sunny, and we got Regal Moon, his full sister Anastasia, and then we have Artemis, which we bred Luna back to Reggie, and we now have just on the ground now Cyrilla, who is Butterfly and Reggie. So here is an example of line breeding some of these cattle. Again, this is the relation of shared blood is probably still only at around 50% for all of these offspring. And the inbreeding index is extremely low. And that's because it all started with sort of a violent outcross. You had a Jersey and a milk Devon. And again, that may or may not be relevant to what you all are trying to do. So what we did first after that F1 cross of just breeding the whole herd to Rex was we used his sons, not just within that family as I just showed you. We used Sonny and Reggie over the entire herd in succession, and they continued to maintain a uniform group, mostly because of the strong genes, the prepotency that Rex had and maintained. Duke's Landy actually was a very heavily line-bred Jersey, so there existed some prepotency within Luna as well. And over time, the type shifted a little bit more towards a Jersey build, but in general, everything stayed pretty uniform. So this is just an example of what we did on our place. But how long can this go on? So we, we're going on, let's see, I guess over 12 years for us in perpetuating this. But as I said, we started out with a very low. There is Jay Lush, the University of Iowa, published this study. There was a herd of cattle, Shorthorn I think they were, Iowa State College, a herd of cattle bred for 20 years without new blood. The short story here is that this guy had a herd of Shorthorns and he bought a little bull calf that he really liked. When he bred his cows to this bull, once he grew up, he loved the calves. He bought another bull after using this one and was not nearly as satisfied. So he immediately decided to figure out a way to line breed to this bull. And so there was this one small injection of a bull that was sort of an overlap, but they immediately moved into a line breeding program to try to maintain the wonderful offspring of this one great bull that he purchased. So the basic family tree in this study, the bull's name was Sultan's Banner, and he was purchased and used exclusively. And as I said, exceptional offspring. This new sire, Roan Champion, was purchased to keep in step with that very common practice of we've used one bull, now we need another bull that has a different relation. So as I said, they were less desirable. They didn't really care for those offspring. So what they did is they kept Sultan's Banner's son, named him Bannerview, and he was selected and used on Sultan Banner's daughters. So this was one generation of sort of an unavoidable first step of close breeding. So you had a son breeding all of his own half-sisters. Then Banner's last, which was another son, but from a different dam, was then used, but he was used to breed his half-brother's daughters. Once again, they took another, now this is a grandson, so Banner's last, another son's, was out of a daughter of Sultan's Banner, so sort of his aunt was used, and he was put into service and was still in service for all of the cows when the conclusion of this study came about. So this was the rough family tree over those 20 years. So they basically took a sire, used two sons, bred them to each of their half sisters, and then took another grandson and laid him over the herd. The result was sort of this award-winning herd. They were not big in the show ring, but they did bring the cattle to some 4-H shows and state fairs and things like that. And by the end of the 20 years, there was a group of 7 that were brought, that were entered into a get of sire class, and 5 out of the 7 entries were full brothers, and a 6th was a full brother in blood, not in reality, but had as much commonality in blood as the others. So really, really closely related to these. And here's the interesting part. By doing this, the average inbreeding coefficient after 20 years was 16.9%, which is only a little bit more than a half-brother sister mating. of 12.5%. And you would expect on your hunch for that inbreeding coefficient to be much higher. But in fact, doing this way of sort of switching half brothers and half sisters and doing that generationally, they were able to keep an inbreeding coefficient that to me is relatively low. The danger point, I think, is most commonly thought to be at 20%. Once you get to an inbreeding coefficient of 20%, you start to really unsurface a lot of problems. And this one, the average was 16.9%. And also to me, interestingly, that the average relationship was almost 43%. So meaning that they were almost half related to each other, even with switching the sires around. So there was a very high blood relation and not so high inbreeding coefficient. So this is really, again, that quote was talking about, which is the essence of line breeding, is to maintain that relationship of blood of those animals that are desirable and really avoid the pitfalls of inbreeding.
Phyllis, can you just explain what is that inbreeding coefficient measuring? What's it mean?
A little bit, because I've studied the practicality of these coefficients, and I've read sort of, as I said, where the danger zone, where the inbreeding coefficient becomes 20%. I can't tell you what the formula is. You probably, if you were so interested, or maybe some of you that are watching know how to make that calculation. But it's just a mathematical equation that takes into consideration that closeness, that the number of very close relations that happen in succession. So the shifts in generation affect that number of an inbreeding coefficient. But if you were to sort of keep breeding, you bred a cow and a sire, and then you got a couple of sibling pairs, and you just kept breeding those siblings, like Nefertiti, right? Wasn't she the 14th generation of brother-sister marriages, I think? You get a very high inbreeding coefficient. And as I sort of said before, that can be either very, very effective or very, very dangerous. Mostly people just want to avoid inbreeding. They just know that they want a low inbreeding coefficient. And to me, line breeding is really intriguing because you can sort of stay under that danger zone of 20%, but you can still keep your relation very high and therefore keep a very uniform group. So I can't give you the formula, but it's an index that tells you how closely related and for how many successional generations those closely related individuals have been bred. I hope that's enough for the listeners here.
That was great. Thank you.
Here's a table that shows, this was not a huge herd. I think, I don't know, I want to say maybe there was 20 or so animals at the end of the 20 years. And maybe this is all of them, but this is the range and the average relationship, inbreeding and relationship coefficients for the heifer calves, for those of you that are interested in those particular numbers.
Oh, Phyllis,
yeah.
One of our listeners, Johnny, has written in that this coefficient indicates the probability between 0 and 100% that genes at a randomly chosen location in the DNA are identical by descent.
Ah.
Full siblings that mate have a coefficient of 25%.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is a schematic to show how they did their breeding. It's a little bit, I have this available and I've sent it to Sheila if anybody wants copies of this article. It's also, you can purchase it online if you want to with some digging, but I made a PDF of the photocopy that I have. And if you would like, you can certainly contact us or whatever, we can, if you want to study this more closely. But this shows you how they sort of bred each half brother to half sister. But I do want to get to leave some time for this. That article was on the heels of another article, a line breeding program for horse breeding. And this article is very similar. It's a similar concept, and it was, again, several years. Horse breeding is even slower than cows, but the breeding of exceptional individuals, I think they were Belgian horses, was also obtained through this similar line breeding concept. And so this also, I have a schematic of how they bred half brothers and sisters to each other. This one is another of the same thing, but they tried to sort of take out the visual distractions of the generations. So this is another schematic of the same breeding program. So what are some practical variations of those two examples, those two case study examples? So you know, within your breeding herd, you could conceivably keep sons out of the same sire, out of unrelated dams. So you would breed your herd to a sire, and I guess I hadn't really said this out loud, but we have just bred across the board, almost in a sense creating line breeding. We bred across the board to these bulls, or sometimes 2 or 3 bulls, and haven't tried to do the specific mating within a breed by analyzing pedigrees, which I know is a common practice. If you're going to put your herds together and use a bull to breed, in a sense, you're sort of stuck with that. And I think that, you know, from a wide view, the answer is to look at it generationally, because what I see in common in these and in the approach that we've taken is that we, if we have, for example, a mating that is too close, that will just be an offspring that we don't raise, we don't keep for breeding purposes. So you could conceivably breed to a bull 1 year, let him breed his full sisters, and then choose not to raise those full sisters, you know, keeping, you know, out of the reason for not wanting to have that high inbreeding coefficient. You could keep only the offspring out of that half mating, and then use his brother the following year. So this generational effect, I think, is pretty significant. You could, and that's sort of the second option, you could alternate bulls and heifers. The only other thing that I can think is to sort of trade bulls with that have a distant relationship to your herd. And you might need to sort of develop a cooperative relationship with your neighbor, but you would have to sort of share your goals on breeding and make sure that you are both wanting to keep offspring out of each other's bulls. This is just a reiteration of a slide I brought up in the beginning. I just broke it out on a way to evaluate a breeding stock. So just a reminder for that the quality of the offspring really should be foremost in your mind when you're using a breeding animal. You want, as I said, a cow that will have heifers better than she is, and a bull that'll improve both his sons and daughters. So another, if you want some more resources, A.L. Hagedorn, also in the 30s, excellent resource, somebody to look up, hunt down his book. I don't know if he has more than one. But breeders tend to underrate the influence of the environment and overrate the importance of inherited differences. So this is where epigenetics comes in. So there are always lots of factors that influence the actual expression of the genes, and environmental conditions, feed, nutrition, all of those things especially can influence that. So rearing is a major influencer. So selection is going to be a key component to our breeding program. And in order to properly evaluate and select, you really need to get full genetic expression. And full genetic expression comes from optimal care. We are a 100% grass-fed herd, so we raise our calves on cows mostly because we don't have grain to raise our calves on. And so very young, before puberty, they need a concentrate. And for us, it's easier to let the cow give them milk than to give it to them ourselves. What are some other factors that are going to influence your decisions around breeding? You know, the quality of your beginning stock. What are you starting out with? Do you need to make huge improvements, or do you already have a great herd that you're trying not to degrade? That's kind of an important thing to consider. And I would say if you have a great herd that you're happy with, be brave and try to create your own gene pool within that. You're never gonna, this was one that blew my mind. You're never gonna get anything better than what's out there if you're always looking for outside blood. So it's really kind of a brain twister. Like, how are we going to actually improve if we're always bringing in something from the outside? And the best you're gonna get is something that's already out there. But you can create great groups of animals just from within if you have a little bit of bravery. So the convergence of prepotent ancestors, this is an interesting one, because what we found when we did breed full brothers and sisters out of Rex was very, as I said, he's very prepotent bull. We had two totally unrelated we have a cow unrelated to Rex. We have a son and a daughter. Breed those two together, and you pretty much get a rubber stamp of Rex. You get something that, even though is technically only 50% blood still, half from here, half from there, really phenotypically looks like a full blood. And that's because the convergence of those genes on both sides from a very prepotent ancestor really double down on the expression of those genes. So phenotypically, you get something that looks much more like, it looks like it would be, you know, 75 or 100% blood when it's really only 50%, but because it's actually, they look more like that prepotent ancestor than either one of the parents. So when you have half and half come together, you get something that's greater than half. You get something that's much closer to one. It was really interesting to us. And also a reminder here, some genes depend on the cooperation of other genes to produce effects. So, you know, the combinations that you see won't necessarily be predictable. That's just sort of a side note. And when you're dealing with horses and cows, the generations come so slowly that selection by itself without line breeding is a very, very slow practice in order to really make great advances with outcrossing. And then the last thing that I wanted to sort of share before I delved into questions, I think this is the last thing. If you would like to concentrate genes, if you want to concentrate the genes of a sire, who theoretically should be a concentration of a very powerful cow herd, in my opinion. But if you want to concentrate the genes of a sire, of a paternal genes, the method is to breed a heifer out of that sire back to her sire, and create a bull. That bull, which is sort of double sired, should be a concentration of those paternal genes. If you want to concentrate maternal genes, you'd want to find a sire that produces a good nick, obviously, that preserves those qualities in the maternal genes. You would, from that cow, breed full siblings together to create a bull. That would theoretically concentrate more. Obviously, it's going to concentrate all the genes, but it would concentrate more heavily on the maternal side than on the paternal side. If you have a very strong herd, very good maternal lines, you sort of already are line breeding, but you'd like to bring in a trait that you know exists in some other herd. The best way to do that without really diluting your line breeding, rather than take that sire with the desired new trait and lay him over the entire herd, bring him in through a cow. So find sort of a matriarch, I called it, find a cow that's very strong in the lineage that you're trying to preserve, and bring that trait in through her. So you would breed the sire to that cow and create a bull. And then that bull still is going to be very strong in all of the traits that you really like because you have this great herd, but it will bring in this new trait. And thank you. So I think I've left a bunch of time for questions, which I'm glad about. I hope there are a lot of questions. And Sheila, do you have, was my hunch correct that we're dealing with mostly purebred herds?
Let's just go back. It looks like it's a mix. When we look back at the answers, there are some purebred and a lot of mixed, as I'm looking at the answers. And Christopher said it's 80% mixed.
Okay.
He's done the math. And we do have a question.
Okay, great.
It's from Ian, and he says, if you are running multiple bulls in your herd, how do you actually know which bull is the sire of a particular calf?
So in general, what I've seen and what I've read and heard from other people is that it's a very high percentage. I want to say 90% usually is bred by one bull and not the others. They usually sort out a pretty clear dominance. But there isn't any way to know for sure unless you genetically test those, and you'd have to pull hair samples. For me, whenever I've run more than one bull, which mostly I run one bull, but in the last 2 years we have actually purchased outside bulls sort of just as cleanup, and we haven't kept any offspring from those. We have a level of prepotency in our bulls that we can pretty much tell. You know, when you look at that calf, you can say that's a Reggie, which is what we've had dropping for the last couple of years. So you may be, if you have a strong sire, you may be able to tell just by looking, even within a breed. But otherwise, there really isn't any way to tell.
Great. And how many herds tell us about your own herds. Like,
okay,
how many do you have, and how many herds, and how does that change through the year? How do you manage your grazing holistically and make this all work?
So there's been a shift over the last couple of years. So when we usually carried around 80 cows total. We milked 50. And as I said, for a long time we had Rex, who was just one bull, and he kept everybody bred all year round. If you're going to raise a bull, if you let a cow, either a nurse cow or its own mother, raise that bull, you will get a very strong cow that can breed. I think we had, let's see, in the middle of a breeding streak, so we had cows, even in that 50 cow herd, we probably had 30 of them calving in a pretty decent window. So a few a week, at least all along. And then one week in particular, we had 12 calves drop from just that one bull. So he was raised pretty well. So you want to be able to raise a really strong bull so that he can breed a lot of cows. We were raising calves with cows, so we had young heifers in those groups. And what we would just try, we left Rex in the herd all the time. And our aim was to get the cows that had calves bred back before those heifers were 4 months old. So we did have a separate group of the heifers that were over 4 months old and under 15 months old, because we didn't want them to be exposed to the bull. So there are some logistical considerations, and sometimes you might have to move towards a little bit of seasonality in calving and bull exposure in order to avoid that vulnerable window for the young calves. But usually it's that 4 to 6 month old heifer, 15-month-old heifer. That's the group you need to sort of preserve and keep away from a bull. If you're doing a really good job raising your calves, you may very well have a heifer bred at 5, 6 months old, if she's getting fed well. So you obviously would like to avoid that. So we, once Rex had, there were a lot of Rex daughters on the ground, we started to bring in his sons. So we loaned Rex out to other farms, and we had either 1 or 2 of his sons within the herd at any given time. And even though they were both out of Rex and very prepotent, their dams were different enough that we were able to see the difference between those calves once they dropped. And not really any rocket science. One was out of a Jersey cow and one was out of a Jersey Ayrshire cross. So the ones with a black nose were Reggies, and the ones that had a pink nose were Jacks. It was pretty easy to tell. There was a little bit of difference in the dish nose, but so Rex was really the first 7 years. We just straight out bred to Rex. We just kept breeding our initial herd to him year after year and collecting F1 daughters. Then we moved into breeding his sons, and that went to the next couple of years. When we purchased a whole bunch of cows, we purchased a couple of bulls too. So now we run, we have 3 groups. When we graze, we narrow that down to 2. So we keep our cow-calf pairs, our bred heifers, and our dry cows. Actually, yeah, all together. We may have to have an extra group of yearling heifers this year, but we combined those 3. So bred heifers, dry cows, and cow-calf pairs, or what would be heifers, are one group, and then the milking cows are another group. Within the milking group, we run 3 bulls. 2 bulls do tend to spend more time trying to beat the other one up and keep the other one off a cow. We have found that to be true, that 1 or 3 is better than 2. But sometimes you'll get a strong dominance between 2, and the other one will just sort of wait in the wings until he's needed. And so those 2 main groups, the dry and bred heifers, are grazed at a separate location. And when we had one farm, they were grazed on a separate set of pastures. And then all of the dairy cows were grazed together on a separate set.
I'm wondering what questions people have. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic. If anyone has another question, you can type it into chat, or I'd also welcome you to just open up your microphone and ask your question as well.
Yeah, I would be very willing to help sort of brainstorm if anybody's got any particular problem that they're, like, well, this is just where I am now, and this is what I'm worried about. Certainly, I would be happy to try to help you through that.
Well, what gave you the courage to go down this path of line breeding, Phyllis?
What gave me the courage? I guess I just sort of, I kind of knew that I would be able to, I didn't jump in so hard and fast that I knew I was going to overcommit myself before I had sort of an exit strategy. So we always, for example, we always kept in the back of our mind that we might need to just bring in another outside bull, and we may need to shift gears. And we just, I think it was a manageable size. 75 cows isn't too many to sort of, we didn't have a very high cull rate, so we weren't really raising very many heifers. So it was easy enough to keep a close eye on them. But I think it's also important that from the onset, we aim to keep the cows for a long time. So we hope to keep cows in production until they're 8, 10, 12 years old, which gives you a lot of leeway. If you know that you're going to have that one herd for a long time, and you sort of mess up a batch of heifers, or you get a generation that you shouldn't have, keeping your cows, if you have confidence that if you really needed to, you could keep those cows in milk one more year, even though it might be time for them to retire, or, there's 2 reasons that the cows leave your herd, right? Well, 3, either involuntarily, they just, something happens and they die, or, I guess only 2, it's either voluntary or involuntary. And the voluntary culling, when you decide to remove her from the herd, theoretically, you have a replacement for her on the way. And as I said, hopefully it's better than the one you had before. So, kind of in the back of my mind was, if I didn't have a replacement of the right caliber for that cow 1 year, I could theoretically keep her for another year and try again. And I had enough time to sort of see if I was on the right track. And I think it's, you really ought to be brave. Maybe one of my aims was to sort of ease everybody's mind that they might start to try to work within a family of their cows with a little bit of confidence, and knowing that you're not going to jump right away into a really high inbreeding coefficient. You're not really going to jump right away into creating a lot of problems for yourself. The other thing we did is we sort of line bred more than one family, because we had such a mixed group. We picked 3 or 4 cows that we sort of, what people would say nicked well with Rex. So they were a good match. When those sets of genes came together, we got something very favorable. And that happened, a handful of times within the herd. And so we started working within those families, like, a Jersey cross named Mary, for example, who's still here. She nicked really well with Rex and his sons. And we have, 6 or 7 daughters and 2 or 3 granddaughters out of Mary, because that worked. And, you saw Luna. Luna's got a bunch of them. There was a cow Frenchie, that was Rizzo. We already had 4 of her daughters, which we liked all of her daughters. And so we worked with that family too, which was another way to sort of be safe. We had a couple of, and we figured we would let the ones that were not doing as well as the other ones fall away over time, and just sort of keep going down the road that was working the best.
Great. We've got another question from Thomas. Do you have any interest in AI, or is the bull easier for you?
Yeah, the bull is so much easier. So we really are happy that we've been able to create bulls that we're happy with, because that's the other risk. But we do use AI, and our tie stall in the middle of winter, and just the snowy, icy weather, on occasion our cows wouldn't go outside, which left them not being exposed to the bull. And we always kept a tank, and so we would use AI. So again, I would dabble with AI to see if maybe there was another bull that we might bring in and start to have success with. And we did. We've got some crosses and some other F1s from AI too. So yeah, I do that too.
Thank you, Phyllis. And we have another question from Simon. He says, with a herd of 100 cows and 3 bulls run as one group, if you were very, very selective in choosing the heifers bred from these bulls to be used as replacements for the herd, could you keep using these bulls on their daughters and granddaughters?
I think you could. It would depend a little bit on how closely related everybody was to begin with. And very, very safe would be to maybe alternate the bulls. Or if you, this is probably the same person that asked, how can you tell which bull, which calves are out of which bull? We have also, so we have 100 and somewhere between 175 and 200 cows in our milking group now, and we keep 3 bulls in there. And we're going to actually be doing something very close to just that. I think you could, at the very least, you would probably, so Rex was 12 by the time he retired. Reggie, we just retired, and he was 6. So we used Reggie for 6 years. Again, if your cows are living for a long time, you can actually not worry about keeping double-backed, you know, him breeding his daughters and you needing to keep those calves. With Rex, that's pretty much what we did, was we let him breed his daughters, but we only kept 2 of the heifers out of those matings, out of all of the years that he was mating. So you could just sort of keep those bulls in there. So year 1, they're gonna breed your 100 cows, and just for ease, say you're gonna get 50 heifers. If you have a 20% cull rate, you're only gonna need to keep 20 of those heifers each year, right? Out of 100 cows, you made my math really easy. So you could choose those 20. The next year, same thing, breed those 100 cows, keep 20 more heifers. The ones from the previous year are just about a year old. In a few months or so, or during that following year, they're gonna be ready to breed. But now you've got 40 offspring out of this bull. You just say one of them is really only successful. You've got 40 replacements that you like on the way. Year 3, you can breed those 100 cows to that bull. You could breed those 20 heifers. You still could take 20 heifers out of those original 100 cows. You see how you can go several years on one bull without doubling back? Year 3, he's definitely going to be breeding his daughters. So you've already used him 3 years, and you've got 60 daughters out of his, and you haven't had to keep any daughters out of daughters. At that point, you might take him out for a portion of the year, maybe when his daughters mostly are sort of coming in, you know, right after their calving window. You could pull him out and let one of the other bulls breed the herd at that time. And I think with just a little bit of management, you could avoid that if you wanted to. What we did is we did keep a few of those sort of what I call double back matings. And some of them worked and some of them didn't. The prepotency of that bull, we didn't want milk Devons, or we would have bred to milk Devons. We liked the cross. We wanted to keep, you know, less than 50% milk Devon is what we figured out. If you really like this bull, you could intentionally concentrate that blood, and you might be very happy with the offspring. When we started to double him back and concentrate his genetics, there's just no milk in the milk Devons that we have here in the United States. So we didn't want to go that way. We purposely moved away from, and that was where Luna came in. We started breeding her sons to her, and diluting Rex out and bringing more Jersey in, because we wanted to move the herd in a way that favored the Jersey genes. Does that make sense? But that's how you would start to think about how long you could keep those bulls in there. And I think that you've probably got enough leeway to experiment. I would keep some of those double back daughters. It's not an outrageous practice. If you've got high quality individuals, I don't see why you wouldn't go for it. Try it.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. This was amazing. I learned so much from you, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
I hope so.
Would you pass the baton back to me on the PowerPoint?
Yes, I would.
I think you have to hit stop sharing.
Yes, I do. And Sheila, you have my email and my phone number. I am more than happy if somebody wants to just talk about some of the other things. I'm not super technically, proficient in breeding per se and all of the calculations, but I have looked at it in a practical sense. So
Thank you for that, Phyllis. I know you've done a lot of work with the American Grass-Fed Association, so you're really giving your time to people. So thank you so much for that. I just want to let people know we've got our next series of holistic management courses coming up online, starting on the 6th of May. And if you haven't yet taken holistic management, I hope you would consider doing that. The online course we find is really fun, and we just slow things right down and take our time in acquiring the knowledge. Subscribe to our 3LM YouTube channel. We put everything out there related to holistic management, and you'll find this webinar out there. And subscribe to our 3LM newsletter. It keeps you in touch with what's going on with holistic management in the UK and Ireland. So thank you. Awesome. Okay, well have a good evening, have a good afternoon, Phyllis.
you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, hold on. I've got to slip off my other call. I'm leaving.